I'm a big fan of the BioShock games. Both the original and Infinite are some of my favorite games of all time. The gameplay is always fun, the narratives are well written and engrossing, and the worlds the games are set in are so well realized and unique. I was so enraptured, get it? I was so enraptured by these games that I sought out all the behind the scenes material that I could find, many of it being interviews with the game's director, Ken Levine. After the release of the two-part BioShock Infinite DLC, Burial at Sea, Ken and the team at Irrational seemingly dropped off the earth, later re-emerging as the reformed Ghost Story Games. Naturally, I'm interested in what this team creates, but there isn't a whole lot of info out there about the new team's premiere game. I did some very light investigative video watching and internet browsing in order to find any info on the game I could. So I wanted to make this video for a number of reasons. One, to collect what info is known about the new game with evidence to support it. Two, to try and logistically piece together when the gaming audience will in fact see the game before us. And three, to indulge in a little bit of speculation as to what we might be able to expect from this game. So let's get started. What exactly is this brand new title from Ghost Story Games? Before we get into the specifics, let's look at a couple of brief historical events surrounding the studio's creation. BioShock Infinite, while critically and commercially successful, did not have a smooth development. If you take a look online, it's easy to find many early trailers and game demos for Infinite that look drastically different from the final game, and features that were eventually cut from the final release. This, paired with the number of delays the game had, proved that development was rocky to say the least. During development of the game's DLC, just a month before the release of BioShock Infinite Burial at Sea Episode 2, news broke that Irrational Games, the studio behind the creation of the games, was basically shutting down, laying off the majority of its workforce, keeping only 15 employees. Ken has stated in this Kotaku article written by Jason Schreier, quote, "While I'm deeply proud of what we've accomplished together, my passion has turned to making a different kind of game than we've done before." This different kind of game Ken was describing is a game that has meaningful, replayable narrative. This concept will be elaborated more later on in the video. After the release of Burial at Sea Episode 2, the team went radio silent for a long time, finally resurfacing in February 2017 under the new name Ghost Story Games. This is when little bits of information start to trickle out to us. A brand new website for the studio was created, which reveals some information that begins to paint a picture on what this game looks like, starting with the studio's mission statement. Their mission statement reads as follows. Our mission is simple, to create immersive, story-driven games for people who love games that ask something of them. While we believe our new games will have strong appeal to fans of BioShock, our new focus allows us to craft experiences where the gameplay is as challenging as the stories. Doing a little more digging into the FAQ section of the website under the heading Game Related is the following. Question. What is Ghost Story currently working on? Answer. We're working on a new immersive sci-fi game with RPG elements. So, immersive, story-driven sci-fi game that will have meaningful, replayable narrative, RPG elements, and a strong appeal to fans of BioShock with challenging gameplay. This sounds awfully similar to another game from Irrational's past, and another game that Ken Levine had a hand in developing, System Shock 2. Along with word that the new studio had been formed, the team's YouTube channel posted a 2014 Game Developers Conference talk led by Ken Levine. This talk is about early conversations the team had internally on how to go about creating a narrative game that is highly replayable while still remaining meaningful to the player. The description of this video reads, quote, "The studio formerly known as Irrational Games is now called Ghost Story. We've set out on a new project. This video from Ken Levine's 2014 GDC talk explains the high-level concept that served as the catalyst for the game we're working on." I will be using some excerpts from this chat in order to establish some of the discussions the team were having in regards to this new approach to designing a game. I will have the entire chat linked down below for you to listen to further if you are interested. It is a very interesting discussion, although I will say it is a very technical, design-focused discussion. Ken even points this out at the beginning, saying that there's no features in the presentation, it's just a discussion. So know that going into this chat.
So to do something really different, we really had to go back to the drawing board, and that required a new structure, a smaller group of people, and time. That was the most important thing. Time to fail, time to fail for a long period where you don't have 150 people who are looking at you and saying, dude, what am I supposed to be doing today? Let's try, as we think about this, to set some goals. Create a narratively driven experience where the narrative elements are nonlinear and they talk to each other, they interact with each other, they bounce off one another. And all these narrative elements trigger off of player action, not off authorial action. Okay, what is a star? A star is an NPC with a set of capital P passions, a defined term, which I'll define in a minute. What's passion? Okay, these are not full psychological models. As I said, Tech Before has been trying to really fully simulate a human being and all, and how they work, but I'm not really trying to do that. Let's go to literature and media. So you know a bunch of stuff about Luke Skywalker. He has passions, right? What are Luke's passions? He wants to prove himself. He wants to go on adventures. He has issues with his dad. These are things that really define him. There's things that probably exist. We all have things that exist. And forget about Luke, just forget the people you know, people you work with. You know a bunch about their passions, but you don't really know about their kinky, weird shit that goes on at home, and maybe you don't even want to know. So there are things that don't really matter. So a passion is what a star cares about relative to the actions of the player, meaning relative to the things the player can impact upon. A passion is transparent to the player, meaning that the player can see these passions and see how they are, the character, the NPC is feeling about them in relation to these passions. A passion must be responsive to the player's actions. It has no meaning if you can't do anything about them. So, example. Frank hates elves, you kill an elf. Woo, he likes you for that, and his passion in this regard will move towards the positive. Nice and simple. On the other side, he hates elves. You help an elf of any kind. You do a quest for an elf, you rescue an elf, you build a house for an elf, you woo an elf. He's going to feel more negative about this. This is all pretty simple, and you've seen some stuff like this in games before already. Frank has three passions that you know about at the beginning. And let's say the passions are he hates elves, he wants a temple to the old gods built, not the new gods, the old gods, and he wants to woo Barbara the orc because she's beautiful. And you can impact all these passions. Okay, so replayability, and that's central to this. The games we made generally have had add-ons. I'm very fond of them, but they're add-ons. They're not add-ins. You add it to the end of the experience. Games like Civilization, XCOM add in to the situation, allow you to start the game over and play a very different feeling version of the game. Then let's talk about the passion pool. Okay, so let's say Frank the Orc actually has 10, we write, produce, record, cast 10 different whole passion sets for him. But in each game, we only get 3. We choose at random 3 of them. So we all have different stages in our life where we care about different things. You're encountering Frank at a different stage of his life. He's still the same guy, still the same character. But at one point of his life, he cares about hating the elves, who temple the old gods, and he wants to woo Barbara. But then he's married, and he still hates the elves, but his marriage is not going the way he thought, so maybe he secretly loves Romeo the elf. And, he wants something different in his life now. And he also is, he's looking to his retirement. He really wants a piece of the cat's eye medallion. And so he's a different guy this time, and he may have other secret passions. So that's, when you come into the game, you'll still see the same people, but they may have different goals. And of course, we can make, over time, new passions, new characters, new quests, new factions, all those things available as time goes on.
As you can see from these brief snippets of discussion, there is a lot of thought going into crafting an experience around player agency and interactivity in a game world. This does sound pretty ambitious for such a small studio. Well, over time the studio has hired on more people. Back on the studio's website, there is a section where you can meet the team, which lists all of the different employees that are working at Ghost Story right now. At the time of recording this, the team has increased from its original 15 members to 35. This is a relatively small studio size compared to the teams they had working on BioShock, but just as a frame of reference, I looked into other smaller indie studios and their staff sizes in order to get some sort of comparison between Ghost Story, other studios in the industry, and the games they produce. Just for transparency, I'm basing this information from Wikipedia entries on the studios, cross-referenced with information that is available on these studios' websites. My numbers may not be 100% accurate, but they should be relatively close enough to the true staff numbers. First, let's look at Compulsion Games, the studio behind the game We Happy Few, which has often been compared to BioShock in its aesthetic. The size of the team there is roughly 40 people. Double Fine, the creators of Brutal Legend and Psychonauts, roughly 65 people. Frictional Games, known for Soma and Amnesia, 16 people. Supergiant Games, known for Bastion, Transistor, and the newly announced Hades, about 17 people. This puts Ghost Story around the middle in terms of these team sizes. And based off the variety of works that these studios have created, the game could really look like anything. It's hard to put a foot down and say this many people will make a game that looks exactly like this. Small teams have been able to accomplish great things if given enough time. And time is an important aspect in regards to this new game from Ghost Story. It's been a while since we've heard anything on the game, something that is even addressed on their website, again in the FAQ section. Question: why is it taking so long to make the game? Answer: we are a small, agile, and collaborative team trying to do new things. It takes time to nail the concept, and it takes even more time to execute it. Our smaller team size and experimental nature does, however, mean that we aren't moving as fast as larger studios might. Before I get into when I think the game will be shown off, there's one more important source of information that needs to be discussed. In 2017, Ken Levine spoke with Eurogamer's Ollie Welsh at the EGX Rezzed Expo. Like the GDC discussion, I will have this entire interview linked down below, but here I will be highlighting some more information that comes to light about the game and its development process.
After System Shock 2 came Freedom Force and then, of course, BioShock. Now, BioShock's got really strong historical and political elements, but it's still essentially a work of science fiction and fantasy. And this seems to be quite a common thread in your work, and you've said that your next game is going to be a sci-fi game. What do you think draws you back to science fiction in storytelling when you also seem to want to engage with like real-world issues?
Okay, you do science fiction, you can make it. You're not immediately turning people off with ideas because you're not saying, oh, that candidate you like, or that person you like, or that policy you like, well, I'm attacking that. You sort of you move back and you talk about universal themes, you talk about metaphorical themes, and I think people are more open to listening and engaging because they don't feel like they're being lectured at.
You said you're going to aim to create a very replayable narrative game. Now, this is a holy grail in gaming. Some have considered impossible. Are there any games out there that you think are making good progress towards that aim?
It's a really, really hard problem, and that's why we've spent the last sort of 2 years or more years just sort of sitting in a room doing R&D and coming up with this approach. And it's totally different way of making a game than I've ever done before. You had to throw away a lot of assumptions about how we had made games before, and we got a little comfortable with making games a certain way. I made sort of 3 games that were, from a lot of ways, similar in how they were constructed. System Shock 2 and Bioshock Infinite. There was a lot of differences between those games, but how you thought about narrative, how you thought about levels, how you thought about quest structure, all somewhat similar. This is completely different and super challenging.
You were talking about the Shadows of Mordor and the Nemesis system. Are you surprised no one else has latched onto that kind of idea for the gameplay to make things where someone kills you and makes them more powerful and remembers what you've done to them? There's one thing I love about the Shadows of Mordor is you kill, say, a boss, like burning them, he'll come back and go, you burnt my face. Are you surprised no one else has taken that kind of idea?
So there's a term we have at the studio which is called radical recognition. And what that means is if the gamer does something, the game should recognize it, and the game should talk about it. The heart of that is something that's central to our game, which is recognizing the player's presence in the world, because that's why we play games, right? We play games so we can have an impact on the world. That's what it's the difference between games and movies, right? If you could probably define it in one sentence, there's a million other differences. Movies don't give a crap about you. Games do. Because I rewrite in recording sessions all the time, working with the actor, right? Because you hear their voice, and you have to. You can tell them, no, do it this way, but if it's just not coming out right, you have an instrument to work with there, and you've got to retune your writing to work with that instrument. And so I've always loved working with actors. I've always, and like this time, We spent a lot of time. We don't have a huge cast on this one. It's a much smaller cast than what we worked with before, but actors are a big part of what we do because character is a big part of what we do. From a narrative standpoint, there's really nothing quite like it, like the world, the setting. I mean, it's science fiction, so yeah, I mean, it's a science fiction game, and probably you can see similarities to System Shock 2 there, because that's sort of, we tend to like contained environments. There's a reason System Shock 2 is on this spaceship. There's a reason that BioShock was under, this city under the ocean, because that sort of allows us to create a coherent world, and we have a different type of ambition than say Bethesda does, who wants to create this hugely expansive world. Hugely expansive world, and so we tend to focus on a very detailed, smaller world. That's consistent for us.
So, more discussion on the benefits of a narrative set in a sci-fi setting, a smaller voice cast than previous games, and the studio's / Ken's affinity for highly detailed contained spaces like Rapture or the spaceship from System Shock. All of these are important details that further strengthen our assumptions about how the game will look. The other important piece of information in this chat that will lead us into the timetable of the game is the comment about 2 years of research and development going into figuring out the approach to replayable narrative. So let's shift gears and try to pinpoint this game's development timetable, as well as when I think we should be seeing this game unveiled. To start, let's look at a timeline of notable releases from Irrational over the years, starting with the release of System Shock 2, which came out on August 11th, 1999. 8 years after, BioShock would launch on August 21st, 2007. 6 years after that, BioShock Infinite would launch March 26th, 2013. Then we get into the DLC. Burial at Sea Episode 1 launches November 12th, 2013, followed by Burial at Sea Episode 2, which launched March 25th, 2014, the last thing developed under the Irrational Games studio. Some other noteworthy dates to include: the BioShock collection was released September 13th, 2016. That wasn't really Irrational, that was more so Blind Squirrel Games, but something to note about the series coming back after a couple years of nothing. And Ghost Story Games unveiled its new rebrand February 23rd, 2017. What do we notice about this information? Well, we can see that at Irrational Games, with the team that they had, it would take them anywhere between 6 to 8 years to develop one of their titles. If you recall to earlier in the video, the news that Irrational was downsizing came before the release of Burial at Sea Episode 2, February of 2014 to be exact. Ken Levine's GDC talk, which Ghost Story notes as serving as the catalyst for their new project, was also held in 2014. If we assume they began having these discussions with their smaller team in the time after Burial at Sea Episode 2's release, and we take the quote from Ken's EGX interview about there being a solid 2 years of R&D on the replayable narrative approach, and if they in fact created a system that they were happy with and felt that they could implement into a game during those 2 years, then we can say with pretty good certainty that the premise and core design philosophy for this game had been worked out by 2016 or 2017. This makes sense seeing as Ghost Story launched their new studio in early 2017. Also, the description of the GDC video suggests that they have their idea and work has traditionally begun on the project. Now that was 2 years ago at the time of this recording. That is to say that the team's been working on developing and implementing systems into the game, creating assets, building the world, writing the game, and as Ken suggested by having a smaller voice cast, recording dialogue for the game for the past 2 years. So this game has been on the prep table and in the oven for about 4 years going into its 5th. This would mean that by the standard of Irrational Games releases, we would be coming up on that 6-year development period that separated BioShock and BioShock Infinite. But that was with the original Irrational Games studio. Ghost Story is not operating with the same workforce as that studio was, as they have mentioned at various points. Ken suggested in the EGX interview that the game is in some ways smaller in scope than those games. A smaller scope for a game paired with a smaller development team means that the game could take a similar amount of time to develop as the larger games did at a larger studio. It's also worth noting that every time E3 has come around in the past few years, people flock to Ken Levine's Twitter to ask him if the new game is ready. This past year, Ken replied with, "Not ready to show yet, getting there." I take that to mean that some significant progress has been made on the game in the past 4 years. And something else I also consider is the early announcement of BioShock Infinite. As I mentioned before, the game was announced so early that multiple trailers were released that showcased stuff in the game that didn't end up being there in the final release, and some fans got upset over that. I would think that Ken and the people at Irrational walked away from that experience with a lesson that maybe it is better to show your game off when it's closer to being finished. That way the game is portrayed in the most accurate way possible. This would explain why we haven't seen anything at all on the game to this point. So, the $1,000,000 question, when are we going to see this game? Based on the information I presented here, I would say that we will be seeing Ghost Story's new game either this year, 2019, or next year in 2020. 5 to 6 years of development time is a long time for any game studio, and I think this development window and the size of the team would suggest that we are getting towards the end of the project. This studio isn't exactly a Square Enix where their games get announced and then disappear for decades. I didn't show this clip in the video, but during the Q&A in the EGX interview, Ken answers a question about knowing when to cut something, and he describes that at a certain point, you need to ship a game. I think this philosophy and mindset means that after all this time, the team should be wanting to get this game out of the door, sooner rather than later. So I would be willing to put money down that at the very latest we will see this new game in 2020, but I have a good feeling that we're going to see what the studio has been up to this year. And as for my speculation as to what the game will look or play like, well, based on the team's previous games and the quote that fans of BioShock should enjoy it, I would say that the game will be played in the first person. Because of this video, I began playing System Shock 2. I think this is a game that people should pick up and try out to get into the mindset for this new game. It's sci-fi, like the new game, and features a more RPG-like progression system than is present in the BioShock games. I could see them doing another contained environment. I could see a large space station or even some sort of moon or planetary colony that people have set up. Playing into the replayable narrative discussion, the point that really resonates with me is the idea of the passion system and how it changes on multiple playthroughs. I could easily see this applied to a small cast of compelling characters, which Ken has already proved he is able to create in his prior games. Would there be dialogue options? That I'm not too sure about. I do enjoy having the freedom to choose how I interact with other people in a game world, but if this begins to break down the impact of the narrative, then perhaps we wouldn't be able to make branching dialogue viable in this game. Anyway, that is what I was able to come up with in regards to Ghost Story's new game, along with what I think the game will be like and when I think we'll be able to see the game. I hope you check out the discussion videos linked in the description because they go into much more detail than I've presented here, and you can maybe learn a thing or two about behind the scenes game development. Write down in the comments what you think. Do my estimates seem rational? What do you think or hope that the new game is going to be like? I look forward to reading what everyone thinks. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing to see what else the channel has to offer. You can follow us on Twitter at PixelsGradient. And if anybody from Ghost Story Games is watching, thanks for the worlds that you people create, and I can't wait to see what comes next. See you in the next one.